Have you ever wondered, like, really wondered if humans, us, were like a total fluke? Just a lucky accident? Or was intelligence like ours kind of inevitable?
It's a big question, right? A question that people have been, pondering forever.
Yeah, and thankfully you sent us some research that dives right into this whole thing. It's a paper by Mills and some others called A Reassessment of the Hard Steps Model for the Evolution of Intelligent Life. And it basically looks at the idea that maybe, just maybe, some of those big evolutionary leaps were so improbable that intelligence, at least like ours, is incredibly rare in the universe.
Yeah, and the cool thing about this paper is that it doesn't just like accept that idea. It
Yeah.
digs into the evidence, looks at other possible explanations for why some evolutionary innovations, why they seem so unique. It even questions if they really were improbable. We're just kind of, I don't know, limited by the environment at the time.
Okay, so let's break down this hard steps idea a little. The paper traces it back to, let me see, 1983. A physicist named Brandon Carter. He was kind of fixated on the fact that humans show up pretty late in Earth's history, but also like way before the sun is supposed to burn out.
Right. Carter noticed that. Like the timing was, well, odd. If you think about how long it takes for life to evolve, all those biological processes, and then you compare that to the lifespan of a star, statistically, it seems like intelligent life should either evolve super fast, like all over the universe on young planets, or it should take so long that it basically never happens before the star dies.
But well, here we are having this very conversation on a planet that's what, about halfway through its sun's lifespan? So Carter thought, there's no way that's just a coincidence. He argued that this timing implies something must have, I don't know, sped things up.
Exactly. And that's where the hard steps come in.
Yeah.
Carter's idea was that there had to be some crucial evolutionary leaps, these hard steps that were statistically improbable given, how much time was actually available. And the more of these unlikely hurdles life had to clear, well, the less likely it should be that intelligence would eventually evolve.
So kind of like winning the lottery, like
Yeah,
5 times in a row, possible, but
exactly. Super improbable. And this paper actually lists a whole bunch of these hard step candidates.
yeah.
Different researchers over the years have suggested, well, lots of different things.
Yeah, it is a pretty wild list. It's everything from how life even began in the first place, that whole abiogenesis thing, to eukaryotic cells, to animal multicellularity, and of course, human level intelligence. It's a lot.
It is. And the paper points out 5 steps that seem to show up the most, kind of like the most popular candidates.
Yeah.
And get this, they're all pretty evenly spaced throughout Earth's history, which I have to admit is kind of freaky.
Right. I know. It's such a strange pattern, and it's led some people to think that these steps must have been incredibly difficult, like evolutionary bottlenecks or something, where only a few lucky lineages managed to squeeze through.
Right, like super tight squeezes. But what if, and this is where it gets interesting, what if there's another explanation? What if those events seem so unique, not because they were improbable, but because of something else entirely?
Okay, now you've got me really curious. What are these other possible explanations? The paper mentions something called information loss, which sounds kind of, I don't know, sci-fi almost.
Well, think about it. Earth has been through a lot, right?
Yeah.
Multiple mass extinctions, tons of species gone. So it's entirely possible that innovations we think are unique now were actually more common in the past, but got wiped out in those extinction events. We're basically looking at this, evolutionary tree with huge chunks missing. So, of course, the branches that remain seem special. We just don't have the full picture anymore.
That's such a good point, like trying to judge a library by only the books that survived a fire, right? You might think all the books were about fire safety or something. So information loss could definitely skew our perspective and make things seem rarer than they really were. So what else? What are some of the other possibilities?
Another idea, and it's a really interesting one, is evolutionary priority effects.
Hmm.
It's the idea that the first successful solution to a problem, well, it kind of prevents similar solutions from evolving later.
Yeah.
Even if those later solutions could be, just as good or even better in a different context.
So it's like the early bird gets the worm, and then all the other birds are like, well, I guess that's that. No more worms for us.
Yeah, exactly. And the paper uses photosynthesis as an example of this, which I thought was fascinating. Turns out there are at least 2 completely different ways that life has figured out how to use sunlight for energy. One uses chlorophyll, like in plants, and the other uses retinol, which is found in some bacteria. Totally different methods, same goal.
Wow. So 2 paths to the same destination, both work perfectly fine, but they just evolved at different times and I guess ended up in different ecological niches.
Right. And the key is that once one type of photosynthesis was established, it might have made it harder for other similar systems to evolve, simply because, that ecological space was already taken. So even if evolving photosynthesis wasn't all that difficult, the first winner might have changed the game for everyone else.
So basically, the first one to figure it out gets to set the rules of the game. And maybe even makes it harder for anyone else to follow the same path.
Right. Kind of like pulling up the ladder after you've climbed to the top.
Oh!
Makes it hard for others to follow.
And you know what? Thinking about it, all 5 of those big hard step candidates, they all fit that description. I mean, each one from the very beginning of life to us, humans, has totally changed the Earth, right? It's almost like they made it impossible to recreate the conditions that allowed them to appear in the first place.
Yeah, that's the idea of niche construction. Life itself alters its environment. So in a way, going back to your analogy, it does pull up the ladder behind it as it climbs.
Wow, yeah, that's a great point. So maybe instead of focusing on, how improbable these hard steps were, maybe we should be looking at how life and the planet have changed together. You know what I mean? Like co-evolution. Maybe the changes in Earth's environment actually decided, when these big leaps were even possible.
It's definitely a possibility. And this paper brings up a really good example of this coevolution. Atmospheric oxygen. You know how we were talking about how Earth wasn't always this oxygen-rich place we know and love?
Yeah, for billions of years, barely any oxygen in the atmosphere.
Right. So you think about the early oceans, hot, no oxygen. Wouldn't that make it even harder for life to get started? Sounds pretty harsh to me.
Yeah, it does. It kind of makes the whole origin of life thing even more improbable, doesn't it?
Well, it definitely highlights just how much we don't know about those early life forms. Oxygen is essential for us and a lot of life today, but back then, for those early microbes, oxygen was actually toxic. They were living in a totally different world, a world without oxygen, and they had their own set of needs, their own environmental requirements, things that might have been around on early Earth but aren't anymore.
So they were like the ultimate trailblazers, creating a path for everything that came after them, even though it was completely different from their world. But still, it seems like such a massive change to go from no oxygen to, well, all the oxygen we have now.
It was a huge transition for sure. Scientists have been working on piecing together the history of how oxygen levels changed on Earth. And we think the first big jump happened something like 2.4 billion years ago. It's called the Great Oxidation Event, or GOE. That's when oxygen produced by those, photosynthetic microbes started building up in the atmosphere. But even after that, oxygen levels were still pretty low for another couple billion years.
Right, and then came the Paleozoic Oxygenation Event, the POE. That's when oxygen levels really took off, getting closer to what we have today.
Exactly, and the timing is really interesting because it lines up with the explosion of animal life in the oceans, A and D on land.
Yeah.
It makes you think that oxygen wasn't just some random byproduct of life. It actually became a driving force in evolution. It started shaping what was even possible.
So it's like oxygen opened up all these new possibilities for evolution. Doors that were locked before suddenly swung open.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those hard steps we were talking about. Think about the last 3, humans, animals, eukaryotic cells. They all need oxygen, some more than others, obviously.
We humans definitely need a lot of oxygen. I think I read somewhere that we need at least 50% of the oxygen levels we have now to, survive in the long term. So looking at the timeline, it seems like Earth has only been suitable for humans for a pretty short time, maybe the last 9% of its history. That's a tiny window.
It is, yeah. It makes you wonder, did we just barely make it? Or was there something about that oxygen-rich period that made it, easier for a complex, oxygen-dependent life to evolve?
So maybe we weren't a fluke after all. Maybe we were just, waiting for the right moment, waiting for those conditions to be just right. And those conditions were only possible because of everything that came before us, all those early life forms that slowly, transformed the planet.
It's definitely an interesting perspective, and it really challenges that idea that these big evolutionary changes were just random lucky events. Instead, it suggests that there's a much deeper connection between life and the planet, this kind of co-evolution, this dance, where each step kind of sets the stage for the next one.
It really is. It's like evolution isn't just about, jumping over these huge hurdles, but more like a puzzle where the pieces, well, they can only fit together at certain times, and those times depend on the environment, which is also changing because of life itself. It's kind of blowing my mind a little bit.
It is a pretty amazing concept, right? This interconnectedness of Well, everything. Like life and the planet have been shaping each other for billions of years. It's crazy.
And that whole idea of windows of opportunity, it's so fascinating. I mean, if all these big evolutionary steps needed just the right conditions, it makes you wonder what other windows might open in the future, or maybe even have already opened and we just haven't noticed them yet.
I know. It really gets you thinking, doesn't it? Like, what if there are types of life out there that we can't even imagine? Life that thrives in conditions we think of as, like, totally uninhabitable. Or maybe there are evolutionary pathways that are only possible on planets that are nothing like Earth.
It really changes how we think about the search for extraterrestrial life, doesn't it? Maybe instead of just looking for planets that are exactly like Earth, we should be looking for planets with similar environmental trends. Places where the environment has gone through these big dramatic changes because those changes could have led to, well, complex life, even if that complex life is totally different from anything we know.
That's a really interesting point. It challenges us to, like, rethink what life, even IS, and where we might find it. It's almost as if we've been looking for, our own reflection in the cosmic mirror. But what if life out there is so strange, so different, so bizarre and wondrous that we wouldn't even recognize it?
This whole paper has been a real eye-opener. I feel like it's not just about hard steps, but hard thinking. It's making us think differently about evolution and about life itself.
And that's what science is all about, right? Questioning, exploring, and always being open to new ideas and revising our understanding of, well, everything. It's not about having all the answers right away, but being willing to keep searching.
Well said. So, to our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a lot to think about. A new way to look at those big questions about life, evolution, and of course, the possibility of life beyond Earth.
Definitely. We've really only scratched the surface here, and we encourage you to keep exploring. Maybe dig into the research on some of those hard step candidates we talked about, or look into the latest discoveries about exoplanets and what makes a planet habitable. It's an amazing time for scientific discovery. So much to learn.
And remember, the universe is full of surprises, so keep those minds open and keep those questions coming.